This video is entitled The Input Tag and is a companion to the book So You Want to Learn to Use HTML and CSS Chapter 12. I'm Jim Renaud from Shawnee State University, and I'll be taking you through this video presentation. This presentation is going to show some of the uses for the input tag in HTML in forms. I'm not going to go into all of the details and all of the various options and ways it can be used because the video would last forever. Check the documentation. If you don't see something you want, I'm sure it's in there. You just need to go look at the documentation to see all of the features. But I'm going to show some texts and numbers and dates and emails and how to use the input tag to input various types of data. I'm also going to talk about using the label tag to label all of your form inputs so that it's easier for the user to use. So you've seen the input tag in the previous video where we did input type submit. But there are other types, for instance, type text, which allows for a box that the user could type anything they want, like their name or an address. There's type email that will require them to put in a properly formed email address. There's type password, which allows them to type anything they want, but instead of showing what they typed, it's going to show dots. There's type number, which allows them to put in numeric values. There's type URL that allows them to put in a URL and a non-properly formed URL that will show up red and suggest that the user fix it. There's a type date that a user has to type in a properly formed date, and it'll even give them a date drop down and a date thing to fill in dates. And there's a range where they'll get a slider to put in, and there are lots more different ways that input can be used. All inputs besides type, you also need to define a name attribute for each one of them. What happens is this name that you assign the input, the data will be sent back to the server with that name associated. So you'll see the name attribute, and that's the attribute that the programmer on the other end will probably tell you, well, we need a name field called this. We need a text field called this. We need a password field called this. And that's where you would put that in the name attribute. There are also lots of other attributes you can define on inputs. For instance, on the number input and the range input, you can specify min, max, and step. Does it have a minimum of 0, a maximum of 100? Is it a step 1 or a step 0.5 or a step 0.1? So you can choose those so that the user has to put in a specific numeric value within a specific range of valid values. There's max length. You can define a field and say, well, it's got a max length. For instance, you've got a text field where they type in their name. You want them to not type in anything longer than 40 characters. Maybe you'd set max length equal to 40, and that way they can't type more than 40 characters. Use style to adjust how wide the fields display. Use the width attribute in style or use the width in style to decide how wide the fields display. But max length defines how many characters can actually be typed into a field. Value is another attribute that you can set that for all of these inputs, you would put the default value. So if you wanted to automatically fill in a certain value that the user could then overwrite, you would put that in the value equal that as an attribute. And you can always add an ID to your inputs so that you can style them and manipulate them that way. And here are a couple of input tags. You can see that input type text user name equals username. So the username will be sent with the value of whatever the user typed, and it has a maximum length of 40 characters. You also then see input type email, name email. So it's going to send the email address the user types to the server and call it, this is called email, and it'll contain an email address. One really important thing to do when you're creating forms is make the forms work for everybody. So what we want to do is we want to associate every form element, every input or anything else with a label. And the reason we do that is so that oral readers or spoken web browsers can speak to the user of what this box is. Why am I here at this box? Why do I need to type something in? Well, it has a label, and it'll read the label to the user. Also, for checkboxes and radios, if we associate a label to them, you can click on the label and it makes the area to click bigger. So it makes it easier to use on a smartphone, or it makes it easier for people who have difficulty with fine motor skills. So we really need to associate a label to just about every field on a form. That's what labels for. They come in two forms. You can create a label with a for attribute, label for equal, and then you would put in the ID of the input statement, the ID of the input tag, or you could put the input tag inside the label definition. And let's look at both of those. So here are two different labels of the two different forms. The first one, you see that I have a label name, and inside the label, it says input type text name, username, max length 40, close label. So the word name colon, is associated with that input so that there's no getting confused. That name belongs to the input. It's semantically connected. Good stuff here. Take a look at the next one is the other example of the other way it can be done. Notice that the input has an ID of email address. The ID could be the same as the name for everything except radio buttons, but the ID, I just made the ID different so that it wouldn't be as confusing to have everything named the same. So it has an ID of email address. Look at the label though. The label says label for email address is email. So it says this label is for this ID. That will let you put the label after or before or even somewhere else, but that connects the label to the input by using the ID attribute on the input and the for attribute on the label. So those are the two different formats of label, and either one of them are perfectly fine. It's just up to how you want to do your styling and how you want to write the rest of your form as to which one you use. So here I have a simple web page with 4 input elements. The first input element has a name of name and is a type text. The second input element has a name of email and is of a type email. The third is an element of type date called birth date. And you can see up above when you click on the birth date, well, you can't see it, but if you had this page actually up and working, you could see by clicking on that, a date chooser panel appears and makes it real easy for the user to type in a valid date. Much easier, much easier. And then notice number of children is also a type number with a minimum and maximum of 0 and 20 with a step 1. On your smartphone browser is so smart that when you click on a number field, instead of it bringing the full keyboard up, it just brings a numeric pad up, which makes it so much easier to enter numbers. So if you use a text to enter numbers, they get the full keyboard and they've got to go shift to the numbers or hold it down or do whatever. But if you use a type number, it'll automatically go to the number keypad. So much easier, so much better. And it's just so much better for the semantic nature of HTML, that each of these inputs have a specific type for the specific type of data you want the user to put in them. This concludes video 12B. This presentation is copyright 2020 by James Imrino, PhD. You can contact me at jim@renejm.com. with any comments or corrections or anything else. This work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License, and I'd like to say thank you very much for watching.